Maybe you've never doubted whether or not God exists, but maybe you have. And I'm afraid that when we do have doubts about the existence of God or about other things concerning our faith, in many cases, we're afraid to tell anybody. And so what happens is that doubt, or those doubts, fester inside of us, right? They keep eating away at us. Surely somebody in here has experienced this. And what happens then is that if we never tell anybody about them, if we never search for answers, eventually they reveal themselves. Those doubts reveal themselves in our lives. Now, if you are doubting, or if you have doubted before, I want to offer a word of encouragement and say that doubt reveals some good things about you. One good thing is that it means that you're really taking seriously your faith. You're thinking through why you believe what you believe, right? You're trying to find the truth. And I think that's one of the reasons why Jude, in Jude 1 verse 22, tells us to have mercy on those who doubt. There are some people who challenge the Christian faith and really who challenge anything. And they do it for bad reasons. They do it because they're just looking for a fight, or they're doing it because they've been hurt by someone who is a Christian, and so they want to hurt Christianity in return. So there are people who challenge Christianity for bad reasons. But I think the majority of people who have doubts concerning Christianity do it for good reasons, because they're searching for the truth, and they hear something, and it causes them to doubt, especially people who grow up in the church and then maybe leave when they get older. Most of those people, surely some of them probably have bad motives, but I would think that most of those people didn't set out to hurt the church or to leave the church. And I'm talking specifically about people who leave for intellectual reasons. They do it because they just never found answers. So if you've doubted, I just want to offer you that word of encouragement to say, please trust somebody with your doubts. Please look for help, right? And also, I don't say this to put down people who have never doubted before, because, there's no saying, whether you, I'm not trying to say that you take your faith less seriously than somebody who has doubted or is doubting. But I just want to offer that word of encouragement to people who are doubting. But with that said, I would assume that most people in here are probably pretty convinced that God exists, right? But most people, or a growing number of people in our country, are not. Now, we talked about the existence of God a while ago, but I want to bring these numbers back to your mind just to remind you of where our country is at right now. So 4% of American adults, this research is done by the Pew Research Center in 2018 and 2019, 4% of American adults are atheists. They call themselves atheists. That's up from 2% in 2009. And then 5% of American adults consider themselves to be agnostic, which means they have no idea, really, no strong idea, whether or not God exists. So 4% atheists, 5% agnostic. Those numbers are from 2 years ago and 3 years ago. So we would imagine that given the trends, it's probably at 10% by now, total. So I think we're safe in saying that 1 out of every 10 American adult either doesn't think that God exists or isn't sure either way, doesn't really have a good idea either way. So this is a very relevant topic in our society. You, chances are, know somebody who is an atheist or an agnostic. So this is very important. If you remember the last time we talked about this, we talked about the two arguments that I think are the most powerful for God's existence. But if you remember, I told you last time that neither one of those was my favorite argument for the existence of God. Now tonight, we're going to talk about my favorite argument for God's existence. And as we do that, we're going to ask, once again, the question, does God exist? Now, before we get to the actual argument, as we ask this question, we have to ask another one. How do we talk in any kind of meaningful way about the existence of a being whom, because of his very nature as a spirit, we can't touch or taste or smell or hear or see? John 4:24, God is spirit, so we can't experience him with any of our five senses, right? So how do we talk in any kind of meaningful way or prove in any kind of meaningful way the existence of a spirit? Well, what we did before is what we're going to try to do again tonight, and that is to start with what we do know and work backward to what we don't know. So what we did last time is we started with cause and effect and design and designer. So we said, we know that there's an effect, so there has to be a cause. We know that there's a design, so there has to be a designer. So we started with what we do know, worked backward to what we don't know. We're going to do the same thing tonight, but in a little bit of a different sense. But before we get there, I want to say this very quickly. So I think that all of these arguments on their own, and there are so many arguments for God's existence, not just these three, but I think all of these arguments are valid and true arguments, right? And by themselves, they each make the existence of God more likely than not. So each of these arguments individually can do that. But what we're trying to do is like a lawyer. So if you're a lawyer and you're trying to build a defense for your client, right, you're going to interview different witnesses. And all the better if those witnesses are independent of each other. So you have somebody over here who's saying your client is innocent, somebody over here who has no connection to your client, and they're also saying they're innocent. So you want to build build this case based upon independent data, right? Independent witnesses. And so when you put those together, put those witnesses, that data together, it creates a strong case, right? So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to collect all of this independent data, these independent arguments that say that it is more likely than not that God exists, and then combine them together for a stronger case together than they ever would be apart. So that's what we're doing. And tonight, we're going to talk about what's called the morality argument for God's existence. A few years ago, the American Humanist Association sponsored a campaign where they put this sign on the sides of buses in large U.S. cities, and it said, "No God, no problem." And then under that, it had a subtitle, "Be good for goodness sake." Now, that subtitle probably sounds pretty familiar to you, right? It comes from the Christmas song, "Santa Claus is Coming to Town." Now, this song portrays Santa Claus as this sort of omniscient, godlike figure who knows when you've been sleeping, he knows when you're awake, he knows if you've been bad or good. So the song's advice is, be good, for goodness sake, right? So as that song uses it, be good for goodness sake, is a sort of expletive. It's saying that Santa Claus, he knows if you've been naughty or nice, so be good for goodness sake, because Santa Claus is coming to town. So that's why you should be good. But as the humanists use it, it's a very clever pun. So they take that phrase and they take the comma out of it. They say, be good for goodness sake, right? You see, there's no comma in that phrase on the screen. So what they're saying is that's why we should be good. We should be good because goodness is an end in and of itself. Goodness is the right thing to do. Therefore, we should be good. So that's what the American humanists are saying. Now, I think what they rightly see is that this perverted theology that says that we should be good because of the rewards that might come from it is completely wrong. We shouldn't be good because of rewards that might come from it. Like, that shouldn't be our main motivation. That's selfish. That's self-centered. It's looking out for self-interest. We should be good because being good is good, right? Because it's the right thing to do. Goodness is an end in and of itself. So I think their subtitle actually gets it right. The problem I have is with the main title. No God, no problem. The problem with that is that if there is no God, then why think that things like good and evil actually exist at all? If there is no God, then what is the standard for goodness and badness? How can we be good without God? Now, at one level, the answer to this question is obvious. Say that there's a cat stuck in a tree, and an atheist climbs up in the tree, gets the cat, takes it down, he saves the cat. Well, that atheist in that moment was good, right? And we would say that atheists absolutely can live good, moral lives. So that atheist can be good without believing in God. But that's not really the question that's raised by the American Humanist campaign. The question is not, can we be good without believing in God? The question is, can we be good without God? If God does not exist, then what basis is there for objective good or bad, for objective right or wrong? If there is no God, then the difference between good and evil is like the difference between driving on the right hand versus the left-hand side of the road. So the side of the road that you drive on changes depending on the culture and society that you're in, right? So in America, we drive on the right-hand side of the road. In other countries, they drive on the left-hand side of the road. And there's no objective right or wrong. Well, I guess there is an objective right in this case, but right in a different sense. There's no objective right or wrong about which side of the road you're supposed to drive on, right? Doesn't really matter in a moral sense. But if there is no God, then that's what morality is like. It's like preferring one flavor of ice cream over another. So take vanilla and chocolate ice cream. Now, I would say that vanilla ice cream is objectively better than chocolate ice cream. But actually, it's not, right? That's just a preference that I have. And I'm getting some really mean stares right now. I'm so sorry. So vanilla ice cream, I would say, is better than chocolate ice cream. But that's my subjective preference, right? So that I am the subject, the ice cream is the object. If vanilla ice cream was inherently better than chocolate ice cream, then it would be objectively better because it's the object. But because I am the subject and I prefer that, that's a subjective truth, not an objective truth. So I can't apply it to other people. Now, I'm using these analogies, and hopefully that will make more sense as we go along, because we're going to be talking about those the words objective and subjective some more as we go along. But for now, let's just say that that's how morality is without God. It's just subjective. In fact, any concept of morality at all would be impossible without God. Morality would be impossible. Now, think about that. And you don't just have to accept it right now just because I'm saying it, but think about what I'm saying. Without God, morality would be impossible. So saying that something is good or bad, saying that something is right or wrong, would be completely impossible. So say that you walked out of here tonight and you saw somebody beating up another person, and your natural instinct is to say, you know what, that's not okay, right? And you're going to hopefully either stop it or get somebody who could stop it and put an end to that, because it's not okay for somebody to abuse somebody else. But without God, why? Without an objective reference point, why would something like that be wrong? Is it just because we feel that it's wrong? Because some people feel that it's not. Obviously, that person beating that other person would feel that way. So that kind of gives you a precursor to where we're going tonight. But let's look at this quote from Richard Dawkins, who is one of the four horsemen of atheism, right? He's an evolutionary biologist, emeritus fellow at New College, Oxford, just really smart guy. He says, on a world without God, he says this: in a universe of blind forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky. And you won't find any rhyme or reason to it, nor any justice. He goes on to say, there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. So he's an atheist. He believes that we live in a world without God. He's saying, in this world, there is no evil. There is no good. There's nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. He goes on to say that DNA doesn't care. DNA just is. So that's the atheist perspective. So let's talk about this phrase just for a second. Objective morality cannot be based on subjective humanity. So this is the phrase that we're going to kind of explore for the rest of our time. And we're going to introduce the argument tonight and talk about it for the rest of our time. And then next time I preach, we're going to finish up because there's a lot that goes into this. But objective morality cannot be based on subjective humanity. Now, while you're thinking about that, let me give you a reason why you should care about this. Why does any of this matter? Why should you care about objective morality or subjective humanity or anything along these lines? Because our society is making incredibly important moral choices. And without an objective reference point, we face a very grave danger. So let me give you an example of where this went wrong. It's an example all of us will recognize. Back in the 1930s and 1940s, Nazi Germany. So at the beginning of the 1930s, there were about 9 million Jews who lived in Europe. Now, Hitler's Nazi German government committed genocide, right? And they murdered 6 million of those 9 million Jews. So they exterminated about 1 million Jewish children, 2 million Jewish men or women, and 3 million Jewish men. Not only did they murder them, they also herded them into railway cars like cattle and shipped them to concentration camps. Now, on the bottom of these railway cars, there was often what was called quicklime, which was the substance that would burn the feet of the prisoners. They didn't have shoes on. It would burn the feet of the prisoners, including the children. The Jews were starved and gassed and experimented on literally like animals. So I don't want to be like too crude here, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. But one thing that they had to endure was that a lot of prisoners, because there wasn't enough room on the bunks that they were assigned in these camps, they had to sleep on the floor in human waste. They didn't have anywhere to relieve themselves, so on the floor, and they would have to sleep in it. Some prisoners were forced to activate the gas chambers themselves that would kill their fellow countrymen. And then after the gas chamber was done, to handle those corpses, because the constant killing and stacking of bodies was too much, even for some of the guards. So instead, some of the guards, on occasion, were treated to lavish Italian vacations and time away from the camp to try to keep them human. Now, Hitler also slaughtered another 3 million Soviets, Poles, Gypsies, and people with disabilities. 9 million people in total, innocent civilians, not just in war. And all of this was okay, according to German law. At the end of World War II, if you were alive then, you might remember this, or from history class, if you're a little bit younger, At the end of World War II, the Nazis were brought into the Nuremberg trials, right? And they were tried for what they had done. And in these trials, they argued that they had not broken any laws. They said, well, we haven't broken German laws because our laws allowed us to do what we did. We haven't broken British laws because we're not British. We haven't broken American laws. We're not American. So they would go on, and how are you supposed to convict these people if they hadn't broken any laws? They argued, what laws that apply to us have we violated? Now, if you were alive back then, you might remember this, or from your history books, you might remember what the Chief Justice for the United States, who was presiding over the proceedings, argued. He argued that they violated a higher law, one that was above the provincial and the transient. In other words, they violated a law that's applicable to all people at all times, whether the people know about the law or care about the law or not. And that was eventually what convicted the Nazi war criminals. Now, without that grounding of a higher law, why is what they did wrong? Why is murdering an entire race of people wrong? Why is murdering preborn babies wrong? Why is euthanasia, killing elderly people and disabled people, why is that wrong? After all, we kill animals who are no longer fit to live, right? Richard Dawkins, who once again is one of the four horsemen of atheism, once admitted that believing in a godless state and acting consistently upon that belief would produce a very nasty society in which to live. Think about what he's saying. He's saying if everybody believed what I believed and lived according to that belief, you wouldn't want to live. It would be a very nasty society in which to live. This is a quote from Apologetics Press. They say, with no way to reach a rational conclusion on what is ethical, man finds himself, and ethical basically just means moral, man finds himself lost on a sea of despair where might makes right, where the strong crushes the weak, and where each man does what is right in his own eyes. Morals and ethics without God is not a pretty picture. So this debate is important on so many levels. Obviously, it matters with what we're talking about tonight specifically, that whether or not God exists. That's probably the most important question, at least the most basic question that any of us will ever answer. But it also matters on incredibly much so on a societal level, because I think one of the main reasons why so many of our society's choices have been so unchristian-like, right, recently, is because we don't acknowledge that there is objective morality. As a society, we don't acknowledge that God exists and that He legislates morality. So that's one of the reasons why this matters so incredibly much. But let's talk specifically right now about what this means for the existence of God. Let's talk specifically about the argument itself. So this is the argument. It says that if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. So like I said, this is called the morality argument. And what makes this argument for God's existence so convincing is that most people, like in America, but also in the world, actually believe both of the premises. So they believe 1 and 2 on the screen already. They just never connected them into the logical conclusion. So I would say that the two arguments we talked about last time, cause and effect and design and designer, are the most powerful arguments for God. But I would say that this argument is the most convincing for most people today. And let me give you an example of why. So the value of tolerance is deeply ingrained into our culture, right? Everybody thinks that they have to tolerate everybody else, and that tolerating something means that we can't think that something somebody else does is wrong. So what's interesting about that is that, as I'm sure you've heard it pointed out, like when I have to tolerate something and I turn intolerant toward people who don't tolerate, right? So it's logically contradictory. That's the word. But I got distracted. I couldn't think of my word. Okay, yeah. So what makes this argument so powerful is that people usually believe both premises, right? But they've never connected this into its logical conclusion. So they believe that tolerance is something that all people at all times should be. They should be tolerant. But what's interesting is that when we say that, when we live by that, we're making an objective moral claim. We're saying that tolerance is objectively right, and intolerance is objectively wrong, right? So we're saying that for all people at all times, tolerance is the right thing to do. And for all people at all times, another one that's really big in our culture, equality is the right thing to do, the right thing to have. Likewise, our culture would say that things like racism and hatred are wrong for all people at all times. So this argument is so convincing because most people believe in both the premises. They believe in number 1 and number 2 because they believe that there are objective moral values and duties. They just never connected this into the logical conclusion. So let's talk about it. Let's start with this first premise, and we're only going to get through this first one tonight, and then we'll talk through the second one and the conclusion next time. But let's talk about this first premise. Is it true? You have to ask that question. If God does not exist, is it true that objective moral values and duties do not exist? Now, first, there are a lot of words there, right? And there are a lot of words that we don't necessarily use all the time and don't necessarily use in this context. So let's define some terms very quickly. First, morality, moral. It's just really basic. It has to do with how we live, how we live our lives, right? What we do. That's one that most of us probably know already. But let's talk about what values mean in this context. Basically, it means good and bad. So if I make a value judgment of something, I'm evaluating that thing. I'm saying it's either good or bad. So values have to do with good and bad. Duties have to do with right and wrong. So those two things might seem like very similar or even the same thing, duties and values. But they're actually different, and it's very important for us to think through this. So there are some things that are good for us to do that we don't have to do. For example, the Bible teaches the value of marriage, right? It says that marriage is a good thing to do. But it also doesn't say that we have to be married. So marriage is a good thing to do. There's a value to it, but it's not required. It's not a duty. So it's morally valuable, but it's not morally obligatory. So we don't have to do that. So that's just one example of where something is good, but it's not right necessarily, in that we don't have to do it. Same thing with bad. There are some things that are bad that are not wrong to do. So eating a donut is probably objectively bad, right? But if it was objectively wrong, then all of us would probably need to repent, because wrong in this context means that we cannot do it or should not do it in any case. So that illustrates the difference between values and duties. Now, objective. This is really key for this discussion. When we say that something is objective, we're saying that that thing is true, whether you believe it or not. We're saying that it's independent of people's opinions. Now, subjective means that it's dependent on people's opinions. Now, this goes back to the ice cream and the side of the road, right? There are some things that are objective, some things that are subjective. So when we say that there are objective moral values and duties, what we're saying is that certain things are good and bad. Certain things are right or wrong, independent of what anybody thinks. So it doesn't matter what any of us think. It doesn't matter what anybody on earth thinks. Some things are right and wrong. Some things are good and bad. For example, even if the Nazis had won World War II and they succeeded in wiping out everybody who disagreed with them, or they succeeded in convincing everybody who disagreed with them that they actually were right. So let's say that happened. Say that the Nazis won World War II and they wiped everybody out or convinced everybody. And so now everybody on earth thinks that what the Nazis did was actually the right thing to do. Now, what this means is that what they did would still be wrong. Even if everybody on earth thought that what they did was good and right, it would still be bad and wrong. So that's what this means, that there is objective morality. There's objective moral values and duties. So when you explain it like this, like when you explain what this actually means, most people will, like I said, will agree with this. They will agree that some things are right for all people at all times. Some things are good for all people at all times, and some things are bad and wrong for all people at all times. So most people already agree with this. But let's ask the question, what if God does not exist? Is this possible? Is this the belief that almost everybody holds possible without God? Now, some atheists will accept this premise, which says that it's not possible. So this is a quote from J.L. Mackie, who was of Oxford University. He was one of the most influential atheists of the 20th century. He said, if there are objective values, they make the existence of a God more probable than it would have been without them. Thus, we have a defensible argument from morality to the existence of a God. So some atheists accept this premise, but most don't. So what we're saying is that without God, everything would be subjective. There would be no right or wrong, no good or bad. Nobody would have to follow something other than like their country's laws. But then you have to say, well, why should I follow those if not for punishment? So nothing objective, nothing that doesn't depend on people's opinions. So most atheists will not accept this. They will say that we can't have objective morality without God. So your average atheist will want to say that human beings are morally valuable. He or she will want to say, for example, that their children are morally valuable, and that it's good to care for them and bad to abuse them. So that's what the average atheist will want to say. Well, how do they justify that? Most will say that whatever helps humans is good, and whatever hurts humans is bad. End of story. So that's what's called humanism. So the American Humanist Campaign that we talked about at the very beginning of our study, that's humanism. Whatever helps humans is good. Whatever hurts humans is bad. Now, that on the surface, that might seem logical and consistent, right? So it might seem like fair to say that I'm going to walk out of here and I'm going to live my life and I'm going to try to help people and not hurt people. That seems like a good way to live your life. But I think that there are two really big problems with it. So let's talk about them. First, that stopping point is arbitrary. Why choose humans? That's what I mean. Why choose humans? There's no reason to justify stopping at humans. Now, what am I saying? So say that you're an atheist and an evolutionist. Remember that in your mind, we are all animals, right? So we are all highly evolved animals. So why should we be more special than any other animal? This is a quote from Peter Singer, who is an Australian ethicist, and he's of Princeton University. He says, "It should be obvious that the fundamental objections to racism and sexism made by Thomas Jefferson apply equally to speciesism." Now, speciesism is preferring your species over another because you are that species. So remember, we're animals from the atheist perspective. So it's preferring humans over other animals because we're humans. So just like racism is preferring your race over another race because you are that race, speciesism is preferring your species over another because you are that species. So he's saying that just on the atheist perspective, just like sexism and racism are wrong, speciesism is wrong. So he continues, "If possessing a higher degree of intelligence does not entitle one human to use another for his or her own ends, how can it entitle humans to exploit non-humans for the same purposes?" So notice that he's saying that morally speaking, humans and animals are on the same footing, right? So that's not his point, but that is implicit within his point. He's saying that we should treat animals as equals. And he's saying that just because we're smarter than animals doesn't mean that we can treat them as inferior to us, just like smarter humans can't treat not as smart humans as inferior to them just because of their level of intelligence. So that's his argument. That's what he's saying. But notice that as he does this, he's putting animals and humans on equal footing. Now, Peter Singer is a leading atheist ethicist. He's a very big deal. I'm trying to quote leading atheists, actual academic atheists, because we want to deal with the good arguments, right? We don't want to deal with just any argument. We want to deal with the best argument that atheists have. So, but from this quote, just notice that he's putting humans and animals on the same moral footing. Now, this next quote is from Richard Dawkins. We've quoted him a couple times already. He says, "There exists no objective basis on which to elevate one species over another." Now, what was he saying? He's saying that we can't elevate humans over, say, mosquitoes. "Chimp and human, lizard and fungus, we all have evolved over some 3 billion years by a process known as natural selection." He goes on to say, "Whether the ethic of speciesism can be put on a logical footing any more sound than that of racism, I do not know. What I do know is that it has no proper basis in evolutionary biology." What's he saying? He's saying that on atheism, human beings should have no more rights than animals do. So, now this is a whole another matter entirely, right? But as it relates to our discussion tonight, why should what's good for humans be our standard for what's good and what is bad? That's guilty. Remember, that's humanism. That what helps humans is good, whatever hurts humans is bad. But that's guilty of speciesism. It's guilty of preferring humans over other species simply because we are human. So, why should we matter more than rats or mosquitoes or elephants? Why is whatever helps us good and whatever hurts us bad? And why do we get to decide that? So, why is it wrong to murder another person that is a member of our species, but it's not wrong to kill a mosquito that's about to bite you? Why would that be? Why would one be wrong and the other not be wrong? So first, why choose humans? First problem with speciesism or with humanism. Second, and this is mind-blowing, their explanation doesn't make sense, okay? Super deep, but let's talk about what I mean. So a common response to what I'm saying right now is a really complicated explanation of how this works. So basically, they will often say that once the physical properties of a situation are in place, then the moral properties necessarily attach themselves onto that situation. Now, this is the technical term for this is that they supervene onto the situation. So let's make this real life. So, for example, say that, like we said earlier, we walk outside and somebody is beating up somebody else. So they would say that once the physical properties are in place, that's a physical event, right? It's happening in the physical world. So once those physical properties are in place, that person is beating up that other person, the moral property of badness necessarily attaches itself to that situation. Now, if this doesn't make sense, that's what I'm saying. But then let's take a counterexample. So say that a woman is nursing her newly birthed baby. So they would say that once those physical properties are in place, then the moral property of goodness necessarily and automatically attaches itself to that situation. In other words, it's a good moral thing just because it is a good moral thing. But why? Why would we think that these moral properties that we have no scientific reason to think that they exist. Why would we think that they just necessarily and automatically attach themselves onto physical situations? And what the normal response to this is that we just feel that they're there. We have this intuition, which is absolutely true, right? Almost everybody has this moral intuition that certain things are right, certain things are wrong, certain things are good, certain things are bad. So we agree with that. That's the second premise of our argument, that objective moral values and duties do exist. But that doesn't explain humanism. It doesn't give a reason for why we should choose humans. It doesn't give a reason as to why this makes sense, why these moral properties even exist in the first place, much less that they somehow magically attach themselves to this situation. So if you're confused, that was kind of my goal, because it's confusing. It's not logically consistent, their explanation for why this happens. Remember that on atheism, we are just highly evolved animals. Remember? And animals have no moral duties. They have no moral obligations to one another. The late atheist of Harvard University, George Gaylord Simpson, once wrote that morals arise only in man. Now, when he said this, he verified that the fact that morality is something unique to humanity. So it's never happened that two apes sat down one day and they were like, you know what we need to do? We need to go sit on some pews. We need to talk about morality, and we need to talk about ethics. Right? That's never happened, because there is no moral component to an animal's actions. So nobody, literally nobody, tries to argue that we should take morality out of the evolutionary process. Like, evolutionists don't argue that we should take morality out of evolution. Because if we did that, that would mean things like murder and genocide and rape and incest and cannibalism are allowed, because all of those things are present in the animal kingdom. So nobody argues that we should take morality from the animals. So when a lion kills a zebra, it kills the zebra, but it doesn't murder the zebra. When a hawk takes a fish from the talons of another hawk, do hawks eat fish? Let's say they do. When a hawk takes a fish from the talons of another hawk, he takes that fish, but he doesn't steal the fish, because there is no moral component to any of these actions. There's no morality with animals. But on atheism, that's all we are, animals. So, if God does not exist, then we should view humans the same way that we view animals. No action should be considered morally right or wrong. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties don't exist. So that's our discussion of the first premise. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Now, hopefully, this is making sense so far. I know it's a lot to take in a sermon like this, but thank you so much for following along. And I haven't seen anybody asleep or anything, so I'm so appreciative of that. And thank you so much for thinking through this. And next time, we'll talk through the second premise and the conclusion, that objective moral values and duties do exist, and how that takes us to the existence of a God. Now, as we close tonight, I just want to reiterate how important this is and how incredibly relevant this argument is for our lives. Now, the argument from cause and effect and the argument for a designer from design, both of those are important because they get us to the existence of God. But they're not so important for our daily lives, other than that God exists, so that obviously matters for our daily lives. But this argument matters on a completely different level, because this argument, if it fails, means that nothing is right or wrong. Nothing is good or bad. And I know I've said that, but it's hard to grasp how incredibly earth-shattering that would be if there really are no objective moral values and duties. Because, and we'll talk maybe about some alternatives that are proposed, like relativism, which says that whatever the majority says is right. But if that's the case, then, like we said, what if the Nazis had won World War II and everybody's convinced that what they did is wrong? Well, then, or it's right. Well, then would it actually still be wrong? So there are so many implications of this argument, and it matters so incredibly much. So thank you so much for listening. And tonight, something that matters more than anything we're talking about is your soul. And if there's something that you need to make right tonight in front of other people or in your heart, won't you do it tonight as we stand and as we sing?